1/2006 from Dan Brennan is first, and I'll give him the floor as first speaker on that petition, asking him to be fairly brief and perhaps to bring in other petitioners on the same matter. You have the floor.
Petitions Committee, thank you for inviting me here today to update you on the latest developments on our farm. Here with me today is my wife Breed, Mary White, 3 veterinary consultants, Tom Slevin, Michael Lamb, Jim Crilly, and also environmental scientist Simon White from Limerick University, who will speak briefly on the findings. As you may recall, I brought my case before you 3 years ago. My farm animals have stunted growth, at times they have weight loss and poor milk yield, and there is also severe environmental damage to the farm. The study carried out by University College Dublin observed periods of good weight gain followed by a period of negative growth rate. At the same time as the weight loss occurred in the cattle, there was damage noticed in the foliage of the trees on the farm in the area where the cattle were grazing. Very significant levels of cadmium and sulphur were found in the bloods at the same time as the weight loss occurred. Your committee made recommendations to the Minister for Agriculture, Mary Coughlin, and when this weight loss would occur, liver biopsies, post-mortems, a digestibility study and environmental monitoring will be carried out. These recommendations were ignored except for 2 post-mortems which took place 5 months later. Less than a year ago, we were told by the researchers of the present report that the problem was cadmium poisoning caused by pollution, and we would have the official report within a month. The official report has now just been published, and although the high cadmium results are recorded, we are astounded to hear that the executive summary questions the validity of their own data.
Madam Chairman, my name is Mary White. I'm a Green Party elected member of the Irish Parliament. Several years ago, I wrote the original petition for Dan Brennan, a constituent of mine, that was accepted by the President of the EU Parliament at a hearing at the Petitions Committee. Following on from the Department of Agriculture's most recent report, we now know what I've always known, that Dan Brennan is an exemplary farmer, and the pollution on his farm does not come on his farm. The most recent report from the Department of Agriculture leaves many questions unanswered. I am primarily concerned with 3 issues: that the elevated blood cadmium levels have been excluded from this report, and I believe that the arbitrariness of the decision to exclude the elevated blood cadmium results, thereby eliminating the need to explain them, is a major limitation of the report. I am also concerned that the Irish Environmental Protection Agency was not tasked to check for cadmium when it granted a licence, an integrated pollution control licence, for a nearby brick factory. Thirdly, the report commissioned by the Department of Agriculture and interagencies was not peer-reviewed, and I do believe that that is a major omission. I am asking the Petitions Committee to keep this petition open, to work with the Irish Government and to pinpoint exactly where this pollution is coming from. Dan Brennan needs closure after 19 years. Dan Brennan needs justice. That is why we are here today. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, my name is Tom Slevin. I'm a veterinary surgeon for 45 years in Castlecomer. And I'm speaking as a vet, and the way we see it, the latest study has confirmed this and found cadmium, sulphur and fluoride in the cattle or in the herbage. These are recognised pollutants in brick manufacturing, and they have a catastrophic effect on the young animals. I would add that Dan Brennan's farm is very near a brick factory. And of 270 environmental pollutants tested worldwide, cadmium is rated the number 7th most toxic. It causes an indirect form of toxicosis and affects every part of the body by substituting for copper, zinc and selenium in the cells. This affects cell metabolism, leads to the inability to maintain cell equilibrium, and has devastating results on the cattle. The young animals on the farm have all the clinical signs of cadmium toxicity. Their quality of life is very poor on the farm, and they never fully recover, but they do improve if moved from the farm. This problem has a huge financial implications for the Brennans, and possibly implications for their families' health. Thank you.
My name is Jim Crilly. I'm a veterinary epidemiologist. I was the first person to identify that there was cadmium present on Dan's farm in September 2004 when I took samples from the roof gutters that we examined, and we found extremely high levels of cadmium there. Subsequent to that, in 2005, a cull cow from the farm which was slaughtered was found to contain nearly 5 ppm of cadmium in the liver. To the best of my knowledge, this is the highest level of cadmium ever recorded in a bovine liver in Europe. Subsequent to these, the studies that are part of this report that we're questioning were carried out in 2007-2008. It is our contention that these studies were flawed in their design, in that they didn't look at cadmium, even though 2004-2005 there was evidence of very significant cadmium levels on the farm. The farm parts of it are directly adjacent to the brick factory. The outflow from the brick factory runs onto the farm, and the rest of the farm is exposed to the emissions from the stack of the factory. The brick factory got an IPPC licence from the EPA, having submitted an environmental impact statement. The environmental impact statement did not identify the potential of cadmium emissions from the factory. It should have done, because cadmium is a recognised pollutant from brick factories. The EPA then issued a licence to the factory without picking up that there was no requirement to monitor or control the emissions of cadmium, which at the very least is negligent on the part of the EPA. The factory then operated for the last number of years without any control or surveillance of cadmium emissions. We have found cadmium on the farm, but the studies didn't look at the farm. The researchers were specifically excluded from investigating the brick factory or the emissions from the brick factory. The only way they found blood cadmium, because I talked to them during the course of the study and I said, you want to be looking at cadmium because I found it there 4 years ago. They took blood samples from the animals that they were on trial on the farm, and they found levels of cadmium of 4,000 ppm. 4 ppm, 4,000 ppb, parts per billion. Which again, those levels were so high that what they did is they said there must have been contamination of these samples, and they excluded them from the analysis. In the report they said, we don't consider that we have to explain these samples because we are assuming they're so high that they can't be real. They made, the samples that were taken over 3 separate dates, in August and September. These 3 dates, they said they can't be right. We won't try and justify where the cadmium came from in those samples. Subsequently, they've taken more samples from the animals, and again we found cadmium levels that exceed, I think we can safely say the cadmium levels on 4 or 5 animals on that farm exceed anything recorded by the European Food Safety Surveillance, the United Kingdom Food Safety Surveillance. Unfortunately, in Ireland, we don't have any cadmium surveillance yet, even though they're supposed to have it. On the studies, they didn't look at the herbage cadmium. They didn't look at the cadmium on the farm. One particular study in the report looked at the heavy metal status of the farm, but they didn't look at cadmium. They said the EPA looked at cadmium in 2006. The EPA said all samples in the farm were less than 0.5 ppm cadmium, herbage samples. The normal range of herbage cadmium is 0.1 to 0.3. To say that all the samples were less than 0.5 is to say that everybody in this room is less than 2.5 metres tall. It's not a useful statement. So what we're saying is this report, we would like it to be peer-reviewed, properly peer-reviewed by yourselves to nominate an appropriate authority to look at it in what was carried out and the interpretation of what was carried out. And we need some follow-up on the cadmium. Everybody agrees now there is cadmium in that farm. Nobody's saying where the cadmium came from. We have to look at where the cadmium came from. At the moment, last week we were taking samples from the farm and we were paying for them ourselves. Dan is now reduced to being back where he was at the start, paying for his own samples to look for cadmium. Thank you.
Grazie per questi interventi.
Thank you for those comments. Any speakers?
If I may, forgive me.
Dobbiamo ascoltare anche
Okay. Sorry, thank you.
tempi rapidi però.
Can you be fairly quick with the presentation, please, because we want to take the Commission and allow members to comment.
Very quickly, this is from the environmentalist perspective. I'm speaking for Dr. J.J. Leahy from the University of Limerick, who can't be here today. With this report, we're presenting it that there's an awful lot of correct information in the report, but it makes the wrong assumption. The executive summary focuses on exposure on the farm over a yearly period, whereas the problem observed in the animals is episodic, and the problem seen in the ecology is episodic. So the area predicted to be subjected to the highest total exposure from the factory is totally different to the area exposed to the highest singular events within each year. Basically what I'm trying to say is if you drove from Brussels to Strasbourg in a car, it's 216 miles, and you did it in 3.2 hours, people could say that nobody broke the speed limits. But in fact, that couldn't be true. So we have now mapped the area on the farm that is actually affected. This shows the factory and the farm and the area that is most severely damaged, which can be seen from this perspective of a 3D image, whereby the blue shows the tops of the trees that are affected, the purple the middle part of the trees, and the yellow would be the bottom of the hedges, whereas the most severely damaged is the red. So you can see that the farm is right in the fallout area of this. But they did air dispersion models, which they presented in the report, which, if you look at the two here, you will see that the factory is, the farm is affected by maximum hourly ground concentrations much more than it would be over the whole year. There's another area would be affected on a yearly basis. So basically, the false claims that are made in this report, one of the claims that will be made is the factory is closed, so it's not possible to estimate the emissions of heavy metals. But this isn't true, because a simple chemical mass balance approach was proposed by Dr. Leahy back in 2005 to the EPA, and it wasn't done. This entailed just analysing raw materials used, the shale, the pigment additives, and the fuel oil used in the process, because it's a simple process, analysis of the product, which would just be the bricks, and maybe the flue ash scrapings from the chimney. And the percentage of elements missing has to go somewhere. It has to be emitted out of the chimney. And all you need to do then is study the production records to estimate the amount that has actually come out of that place for a long time. And remember that the shale, the additives, the bricks, the records of production are all still available, whether the factory is opened or closed. There's also an assertion in the report that the cadmium results are not true. But as a scientist, I'd have to say that there's no valid scientific reasons given for the rejection of their own empirical data, the stuff that they generated. And I'd like to say that it's rather like the Wright brothers. In the very beginning, when they got their airplanes off the ground, all the scientists said that the plane would not fly, but it did. So thank you very much for listening.
Grazie a lei. Allora passo la parola a Peter Weider.
Thank you. Then can I give the floor to the Commission to come back on detailed points, please?
I would like to comment that the Commission investigated this matter regarding the Ormond Brick Factory with the help of the Irish authorities. Questions were raised regarding the permitting status, the operating conditions and the emission limit values of this specific installation. The Commission also analysed with interest the report of the European Parliament based on the fact-finding mission in Ireland back from 2007. The reply of the Irish authorities pointed out that the installation falls under the scope of Directive 2008/1 concerning integrated pollution prevention and control, the IPPC directive, as also mentioned by the petitioners, as an existing installation. It was granted a permit in accordance with the IPPC directive in the course of 2001. The IPPC directive requires that installations falling under its scope operate in accordance with emission limit values or equivalent parameters based on best available techniques, the so-called BAT concept. Technical parameters and recommendations for the determination of the best available techniques are set out in the BAT reference documents, the so-called BREFs, which are adopted by the Commission. A BREF document on the ceramic manufacturing industry was adopted in August 2007. Therefore, on the basis of the information provided by the Irish authorities, the Commission analysed the compliance of the permit conditions with the technical requirements of the BREF document, with special regard to the emissions of chlorides and fluorides from the installation. The analysis showed that the emission limit values of the installation were in line with the requirements of the BREF document, and consequently, the Commission could not identify a breach of Union law. However, based on the information presented by the petitioners at the meeting of today, the Commission intends to investigate this matter further with the Irish authorities. Thank you.
Onorevole McGuinness.
Mrs. McGuinness, please.
Thank you, Chairperson, and I'd like to thank Dan Brennan and his advisers for joining us again today. I'm sorry that they have to be here again, but at least we have taken some steps forward since our original look at this. I have a question for the Commission, because you meant the spokesperson has just said they investigated this issue. It seems to me that the investigation involves writing and then accepting the information that's given by the competent authority. And I would like perhaps that there would be a deeper investigation. We now have a scientific document. The experts have said to us that there is good information in this report, but we are concerned about the conclusions that have been drawn, because there is a problem on this farm. It is persistent. We have seen it with our own eyes, and we have not got a conclusion. From what we've heard here, we have identified a particular toxic element that needs further investigation, and that's why the word investigation used by the Commission must be a real investigation, not just writing and accepting what the Irish authorities say. We've listened to a member of the Irish Parliament who is also concerned about this. We together need to bring a resolution to this problem with this report in hand. But we are concerned about the conclusions that have been drawn. What I would like to ask colleagues in the committee is to, as a committee, we need to write to the competent authorities in Ireland to ask them to explain to us why they have drawn the conclusions they have. We also need to live up to the requests of Dan Brennan and his experts and to have this document peer-reviewed. I have a huge concern when I read in the report that further research or analysis may be required, because this has gone on for a dozen years and more. And we have, I think, enough evidence. We are perhaps not looking in detail. It is quite shocking if, as one of the experts has said, the investigators were not allowed to look at the link between this problem and the brick factory concerned. So I am insistent that as a committee which took on with this issue some years ago, that we see it through, because citizens from other member states will have similar problems. So through the chairperson, and I thank you for giving this issue more time than we normally can. It is a very important issue. We must ask the Commission to do more than just write a letter. If they're going to investigate, let it be deep. They mentioned chlorides and fluorides, but not cadmium. Perhaps they might make a back comment about that issue. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole Higgins.
Mr. Higgins.
Yes, Chairwoman, thank you. I'll be very, very brief, and I have to apologise that I'm also at the International Trade Committee and will have to leave. But I do think really that it beggars belief that this farm family, after so many years, has to come to Brussels to try and get justice for themselves, when the position is so clear, in my view. And Mr. Crilly's evidence today is frankly damning with regard to the report and with regard to the Irish authorities, whom the Commission seems to have taken most of their evidence from. It wasn't as if this hasn't happened previously. There was an infamous case, I think the family was the Hanrahans, many, many years ago. And like this family, they went through torture and hell, and the authorities didn't live up to their responsibilities and didn't vindicate their rights, and eventually it finished up in the Supreme Court in Ireland. And even though I haven't reviewed that case, I still remember the principle that it enunciated, and I think it's maybe 20 years ago. And the principle was 3 Latin words, res ipsa loquitur. A fact speaks for itself. Very simple principle, but one that is absolutely clear to somebody who knows nothing about the law. It's very, very clear to me where the source of this problem is coming from. But we have an Alice in Wonderland situation, apparently, that the main suspected source is the one that an investigating authority is not allowed to look at. I mean, enough said.
Onorevole Kelly.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'd also like to welcome the family and their experts here today. Having read all the documentation and looked into it over a period of time, it's quite obvious, it's very obvious to me that this needs to be prioritised by this committee. The way in which this family have been left high and dry on a human level is nothing short of disgraceful. 19 years now, even now worrying about the consequences that it could impact on their family, let alone their animals. And I don't think it's acceptable. I think there's a huge amount of questions that needs to be asked at various different levels here. In relation to the Irish authorities, the report that's been done, the EPA, the empirical evidence that's been used, the data that's been used, the manner in which they accepted some data and didn't accept other data. There's huge questions there. I believe that EPA and the manner in which they've carried out the reports, that there is something drastically wrong. The levels are so high here of toxins that, it's unquestionable that there is an issue here, and it's fairly obvious where the issue is coming from. I believe that as a petition committee, we need to prioritise this for this family. We need to not just write to the relevant authorities in Ireland about this, but we need to actually instigate a huge further investigation that is prioritised with a quick timeline to ensure that this family gets justice that it deserves very soon, because it cannot go on any longer. They can't be allowed to wait. I get very scared when I hear members of the Commission saying that we need further investigation, check further data. It seems to me the experts who are very qualified here are willing to stand up and say under any investigation what they're saying here, and it's fairly obvious the consequences of that in relation to where the pollution is coming from. So I'd ask that it be prioritised by this committee and that the Commission carry out an investigation as a priority and in a very quick, defined timeline that is acceptable to everyone. Thank you.
Grazie, io mi permetto di fare
Thank you. Well, I have to say this has to be fairly quick. A lot of people want the floor.
Ja, also ich habe mir 2 Dinge aufgeschrieben.
Thank you. I've noted down a couple of points. Firstly, I think a fair result on the basis of research of this kind would have a different result, because I don't know whether everything has been investigated that could be investigated. I've got a couple of trivial points. Where does the cadmium come from? I mean, if you've already detected just what the animals are suffering from, a high level of cadmium, then it's rather strange that all these investigations have taken place and the Commission is looking at fluorides and chlorides, but nobody's asking about cadmium. So obviously this is picking up on Mrs. McGuinness's point. I think we have to become active on this. It's quite simple as far as I'm concerned. You have to look properly, investigate it, and just find out where this cadmium comes from, and as quickly as possible, because I think enough time has already gone past. And maybe Irish public opinion would be interested in this as well. And it's a great shame the family's economic existence is threatened. I mean, all of us are biological creatures as well. And I would imagine if the animals on the farm are suffering, well, what about the human beings on the farm as well? So we really have to react and act. And I must say the last sentence, and this is my last point, the last sentence, it just says in the reply from the Commission, to this extent, the information from the Irish authorities has filled some of them, but not all of the information gaps we had. Well, that's not satisfactory, I'm sorry. And I think really the Commission should really have hammered down on this, because if the Irish government and the authorities provides them with information, then the Commission sees that this information is not complete, then I really think they ought to be asking more questions. So we really have to do something urgently.
L'onorevole Harkin.
Mrs. Harkin, please.
Madam Chairperson, I'll be very brief. I won't repeat what has been said. I want to thank the petitioners for their excellent presentation. They leave us in absolutely no doubt as to what the situation is, and anybody who's been following this case will be very clear as to what's been happening. One or two points that perhaps haven't been picked up by others I'd like to mention. We were told about the recommendations from this committee to our department about carrying out liver biopsies, post-mortems, etc. And yet our petitioners tell us, with the exception of 2 post-mortems carried out 5 months later, none of those recommendations were adhered to. I think an explanation is due for that, because, I mean, this committee here was trying to work with the Irish authorities to ensure that a proper investigation was carried out, and it gave recommendations, and it seems that a lot of those recommendations were ignored, and I don't think that's good enough. Secondly, anybody who reads through this document here will see the foot-dragging by the Irish authorities, and as our colleague has said just a few moments ago, the final sentence says that the Irish authorities have filled out some but not all of the relevant data gaps. For a petition that's been here since June 2006, that is just not acceptable, and that's why I agree with Mrs McGuinness that it's not enough for the Commission just to write to the Irish authorities and wait for a reply and then assess that reply. I think they need to take stronger action on this. The evidence is there, and finally, I agree with so many other speakers, the levels of cadmium that have been discovered, and then that those who actually discovered those levels are ignoring them because they can't believe the evidence of their own eyes, is extraordinary. And I genuinely believe that in that situation the Commission has to act in a stronger way than it has been acting up to now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can really understand why people would get rather annoyed and rather concerned with this whole process. I don't think we can close this petition, because we'd be turning ourselves into a laughingstock as the Petitions Committee if we were to do this, and we would be removing a sort of last hope and last expectation of people if we were to turn this down, this particular petition. All of this reminds me of a similar case I had in the Allgäu at the foot of the Alps in my own constituency. This is a dairy region, and we had a very similar problem. We found very high levels of cadmium when we carried out examinations on both animals and human beings, and we saw that there was a glass smelting and colouring factory, and we know that cadmium is emitted at very high levels in this kind of factory, and it was said, well, it couldn't come from this, the cadmium couldn't come from this particular plant, and tests were carried out over years and years, and it was always said that the cadmium levels were below the limits in this factory. And I went on a factory visit, and the actual process is a sort of daily process, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, that's when the temperature arrives at the highest level, and then you get the glass products during the day. And for years and years and years, the tests were carried out, but at the wrong time of day, when there were no emissions. And this is why they weren't able to detect this. But we were able to detect this ultimately, and the plant was closed down. And I don't know whether this is the only solution possible, but in the case of the petitioner, we've seen that the cadmium is there, but nobody really knows where it's coming from. And I think we have to look at this. We have to find the source of the cadmium, establish the link, and come up with a solution. And I don't really know what more we can do. We can say, obviously, we're not satisfactory with this report. and turn to the Irish authorities and the Commission and write to them urgently and say that they really have to investigate this further along the lines we're suggesting to clarify the situation.
Mrs. De Brun, please.
Much, and I too will try to be brief and not to repeat the very strong points that have made by colleagues that have spoken to date. But I agree that in light of the length of time that this committee has been looking at this issue, much less that the length of time that the issue has been an issue, for us to be left still with gaps of information, stated gaps also by the Commission in terms of the information that they have, and the fact that we don't have the information, particularly in relation to the levels of cadmium. I think not only must the Petitions Committee continue to pursue this, but we must become more proactive, and that the Commission must become more proactive on this issue.
Onorevole Childers.
Yes, I too will be brief. I'd like to congratulate the petitioners on their persistence in this matter, and also to sympathise with their suffering that has gone on for so long, and those of the animals. This is an animal welfare issue as well as the human suffering involved. This is the place of last appeal. This is what the European Union is for, but it should never have gone this far. The situation should never ever have gotten to this point where we're sitting here now after 19 years. But given that the levels of cadmium are undoubtedly high on the farm, and the Department of Agriculture in Ireland has dismissed their own cadmium samples, can the Parliament ask the European Commission to carry out an independent analysis of the levels of cadmium on the farm? Thank you.
L'onorevole Wertmann.
Dankeschön. Auch ich möchte mich meinem
Thank you very much. I can agree fully with what the previous speakers have said. I particularly admire the family for the patience that they've had for this lengthy battle. I don't know anybody who's fought over such a lengthy period, 19 years. But what we have to do now is make sure that that we investigate the cadmium levels. Everybody's been talking about the animals, but the family has 4 children, some young children as well. And we have to think in terms of the human beings as well, because we know that cadmium in blood is extremely dangerous for human beings as well.
Mr. Bussinaro.
Presidente, am ezitat dacă să iau cuvântul.
I hesitated.
Și totuși.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I hesitated to take the floor, but however, 19 years is absolutely unacceptable to solve such a file, no matter where, in a European Union member country or in a country that is not in the European Union. Secondly, I am deeply shocked by the lack of credibility of the official data produced by the competent authorities in Ireland about this case. You don't have to be a scientist to understand the shocking nature of this data, and I'm also shocked that there is no answer given to a very simple question. If there is such a high level of cadmium contamination, where does it come from? Because I'm sure it was not the petitioners who inoculated cadmium in the livers of their animals in order to have these results. And even so, the first obligation the authorities had was to look and check whether the samples had been manipulated or not. Instead, the authorities say those results are so high that they're not credible. Well, isn't it their duty to find an explanation, a scientific explanation for the incredibly high level of contamination? Isn't it their duty to see whether there is any relationship between a possible source of pollution, the contaminated animals, and the location of this farm? All those elementary questions have not received a decent answer from the authorities. Therefore, I cannot accept the official position by the Irish authorities. And that's why I have such a huge question mark concerning the Commission's position, which relies on this information that for me is irrelevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I must say I'm rather surprised, just like all my colleagues, about the situation. And I must say I have every admiration for the family because I think this could serve as an example for all our citizens, whether they're faced with small or larger problems. And I must say I'm rather worried about the very bureaucratic way in which the Commission has dealt with this matter. It's quite shocking. We're not here only to discuss these kind of petitions and cases. We have to intervene as well. And the European citizens are perfectly entitled to expect this, and their rights are at stake here. And I think it really is a big mistake, would be a big mistake on our part, if we were not to intervene in a very firm fashion to ask that the Commission act.
I numerosi interventi.
Well, we've heard a lot of speakers and a detailed report from the petitioner and the people with the petitioners. With the petitioner, I think it's very clear the petition has to stay open, and this committee, I think, is entitled to ask that there be more effective action taken and undertaken than has been taken so far. So I would suggest that there be a resolution that can be put to you by the coordinators about how long it should take the Irish authorities to intervene. I don't think there should simply be passive inaction by the Commission, but that we would like to see a proper report on the matter for the petitioner and the action to be undertaken. So there can be further investigation that I think should be agreed on by the coordinators, but certainly the petition itself